The silence was the first thing that truly terrified her. It was a dense, heavy silence, the kind that costs a fortune to create. It absorbed the sound of her own frantic heartbeat, swallowed the rustle of the ivory silk that imprisoned her body, and muted the frantic whispers of her mind. The room was a masterpiece of muted elegance, a symphony in shades of cream and gold, vast enough to contain a small house. A fire crackled in a marble hearth across the room, its flames dancing silently behind a screen of polished brass offering light but no warmth. Emma stood in the center of it all, a fragile figurine placed carefully on display. She was 19 years old. A wife. The words felt like stones in her throat. Her hands, cold and clammy, were clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles were bloodless. The dress, a creation of lace and satin chosen by her Aunt Helen, felt less like a wedding gown and more like a shroud. Every delicate stitch seemed to bind her to this new reality, this gilded cage. She had not cried. Not when her Uncle Walter had patted her hand with false paternal affection, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a successful transaction. Not when she had walked down the aisle of the sterile, empty chapel, her arm linked with his, a lamb being led. Not even when she had faced the man who now owned her, Richard Sterling. He had stood at the altar, a monolith carved from granite and ambition. 49 years old, with hair the color of iron and eyes that held the cold, clear light of a winter sky. He was not a cruel-looking man, but there was an unnerving stillness about him, a profound lack of readable emotion that was more frightening than any open display of anger. He had recited his vows in a low, steady voice, the words precise and contractual. When he slipped the heavy platinum band onto her finger, his touch was brief and impersonal, the brush of a surgeon's hand. Now, she was his, Mrs. Sterling. The name felt alien on her tongue, a costume she was forced to wear. The evening had been a blur of polite nods and muted conversations with people whose names she couldn't remember. And through it all, she felt his presence at her side, a silent gravitational pull. He had said almost nothing to her, merely guided her with a light, possessive hand on the small of her back. Then the guests had departed, the staff had vanished, and he had led her here to this palatial bedroom. He had paused at the door, his gaze sweeping over her for a brief analytical moment. "Make yourself comfortable." He had said, his voice as devoid of warmth as the room itself. Then he had closed the door, leaving her to the crushing silence. That was an hour ago. An hour spent pacing the length of the plush Aubusson rug, an hour spent staring at the reflection of a ghost in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. She was waiting for the inevitable. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. He was 30 years her senior, a stranger who had bought her life with a flourish of his pen. What he would expect, what he would take, was a horror she had refused to let her mind fully form. The only thing more chilling than her fear of him was the memory of the document she had signed that morning. It wasn't a prenuptial agreement. It was thicker, colder. A non-disclosure agreement of staggering complexity binding her to absolute silence about Richard Sterling, his business, his life, and their marriage. The penalties for breaking it were not financial. They were ruinous in a way that spoke of utter annihilation. Her uncle had called it a formality. Emma knew it was a leash. A soft click echoed in the silence. Emma froze, her breath catching in her chest. Her eyes darted to the ornate double doors. The handle turned with slow, deliberate precision. The door swung inward without a sound, and he was there, filling the frame, his presence instantly shrinking the cavernous room. He had removed his tuxedo jacket and tie. The collar of his starched white shirt was open, revealing a strong, corded neck. He looked less like a groom and more like a predator who had returned to his lair. His eyes, those piercing, intelligent eyes, found her immediately. He took in her rigid posture, her white-knuckled hands, her wide, terrified gaze. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with another soft, final click. Then he did something she didn't expect. He turned the heavy antique key in the lock. The sound of the tumblers falling into place was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. A prison door clanging shut. Emma took an involuntary step back, her silk dress whispering against the carpet. He was locking them in. The primal fear she had been holding at bay surged, hot and suffocating. But he didn't move toward her. Instead, he walked to a polished mahogany table that stood between two tall windows. He moved with an unhurried grace that was both elegant and deeply intimidating. He placed a thin, leather-bound file on its surface. He did not look at her as he did so. He seemed to be studying the grain of the wood. "Please sit down," he said. His voice was calm, almost conversational, yet it was an undeniable command. Her legs felt weak, but she obeyed, sinking into the edge of a velvet armchair near the fireplace. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold her trembling body together. He remained standing by the table, his back partially to her, looking out the window at the sprawling, manicured gardens illuminated by moonlight. The city glittered in the far distance, a world away. "I imagine," he began, his voice still unnervingly mild, "that you have been led to believe certain things about the nature of our arrangement." Emma stared at his broad back, unable to form a reply. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear. He turned slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. He finally looked directly at her, and his gaze was so intense it felt physical. "You believe you are here because your uncle Walter Dawson incurred a significant debt to me. You believe that this marriage is your payment, a transaction to save him from financial ruin. Is that correct?" She could only manage a small, jerky nod. Her throat was too tight for words. "It is not." The statement was so flat, so absolute, it cut through her panic, leaving a trail of cold confusion. "Walter Dawson does not owe me a single dollar." Richard continued, his voice dropping slightly. "In fact, I have never engaged in any business dealings with him. I find his methods distasteful." Emma stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. If there was no debt, then what was this? Why had she been sold? The fear began to shift, morphing into something colder, more complex. He took a step toward her, and she flinched. He stopped immediately, holding up a hand as if to soothe a frightened animal. "I will not harm you, Ms. Brooks," he said, using her maiden name with deliberate emphasis. "You are safer in this room than you have been at any point in the last 6 months." The statement made no sense. "Safer." She managed to whisper, her voice a raw, broken thing. "You've locked the door." "The lock is not to keep you in," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "It is to keep the world out." He gestured to the file on the table. "This marriage is a fortress, Ms. Brooks, and you are not the prisoner. You are the treasure it is meant to protect." He walked to the table, opened the file, and turned it to face her. Inside the top page was a photograph. A black and white surveillance photo of her walking out of a library. The image was grainy, taken from a distance. A red circle was drawn around her head. Emma's blood ran cold. Over the past 6 months, Richard's voice was a low, steady anchor in her swirling terror. "You have been under constant surveillance, not by me, by people who wish you harm, people who believe you are the key to something your father left behind." Her father. The mention of him was a physical blow. Grief, raw and still fresh, lanced through her. Her parents gone in a fiery crash just over a year ago. The official report called it a tragic accident, a slick road, a loss of control. "My father was an engineer." She said the words feeling clumsy and weak. "He didn't have enemies." "Everyone has enemies when they are on the verge of changing the world," Richard countered. He retrieved another document from the file. It was a heavily redacted intelligence report. "Your father's last project was not just some minor innovation. It was a paradigm shift. An energy source so efficient and powerful, it would have dismantled global markets overnight. It would have made certain powerful people obsolete. And those people do not like to become obsolete." He let the words hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. Emma felt a dizzying sense of unreality. This was the stuff of movies, of paranoid thrillers. It had nothing to do with her life, with her quiet, book-loving father. The accident, she breathed, a horrifying new suspicion dawning, was no accident. Richard finished for her, his voice grim. It was an assassination. They wanted his research. They failed to acquire all of it, and now they believe the final piece of the puzzle lies with you. Emma shook her head, a violent, desperate denial. "No, that's not possible. He left me nothing. Just debts." "The debts were a fabrication," Richard stated calmly. "A story concocted by your uncle to make you desperate, to make you pliable. He knew they were watching you. He was terrified they would come for him and your aunt next, so he made a deal, not with me, with them." He paused, letting the full weight of the betrayal sink in. "He offered them you, Ms. Brooks. He promised to deliver you to them quietly, in exchange for his own safety and a substantial payment." The world tilted on its axis. Walter's concerned smiles. Helen's cold instructions, it was all a lie. A monstrous calculated lie. They hadn't just taken her in out of obligation. They had been fattening her up for the slaughter. "So where do you fit in?" she asked, her voice shaking with a rage that was beginning to burn through the fear. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I intervened," he said simply. "I was your father's silent partner, his investor. I funded his research because I believed in him. I was supposed to meet with him the day after the accident. When I learned of his death, and later of your uncle's treachery, I acted. The only way to legally and unequivocally remove you from your uncle's guardianship and place you under my absolute protection was this." He swept a hand around the opulent room. "Marriage. It creates an ironclad legal barrier that no one can breach. To them, you have vanished into the impenetrable fortress of Richard Sterling's private life, and they are very, very hesitant to storm my gates." He was telling the truth. The cold, terrifying logic of it all settled into her bones. She wasn't the wife of a billionaire. She was a protected asset. This room wasn't a bridal suite. It was a safe house. "So what happens now?" she asked, her mind numb. "Now," he said, closing the file, "you remain here. You live your life within the grounds of this estate. You will want for nothing. You will be cared for, protected, and kept completely insulated from the outside world. In return, you will maintain the public facade of our marriage, and you will trust no one but me and my designated security chief, especially not your family." The magnitude of his words crashed over her. She had escaped one prison only to be delivered to another, albeit one with silk sheets and silent servants. He seemed to read her thoughts. "I am aware this is not a life you would have chosen, but the alternative was a life that would have been very short. I am giving you the only thing I can survival." He walked over to a large wardrobe, opened it, and took out a pillow and a thick cashmere blanket. He then moved to the long velvet couch that faced the fireplace. He placed the pillow at one end and unfolded the blanket. Emma watched him utterly bewildered. "The bedroom is yours," he set his back to her as he arranged the makeshift bed. "You have my word that I will never enter it without your express invitation. Our marriage is a shield, Ms. Brooks, a strategic alliance, nothing more." He removed his shoes, then his shirt, folding it neatly over a nearby chair. His back was broad, scarred with faint silvery lines she couldn't decipher in the dim light. He was powerful, a man forged in battles she couldn't imagine. He lay down on the couch, pulling the blanket over himself, and turned to face the fire, his back to her and the enormous empty bed. For a long time there was only the sound of the silent flames and her own ragged breathing. The man she had been forced to marry, the monster of her darkest fears, was sleeping on the couch. He had not touched her. He had not demanded anything from her. He had instead shattered her entire world and then offered her a cage to hide in. Emma slowly rose and walked to the massive canopy bed. The sheets felt cool and smooth against her skin as she slipped beneath the covers, still in her wedding dress. She lay there staring up at the silken canopy above, feeling impossibly small in the vast emptiness of the bed. The fear of an unwanted touch was gone, replaced by a much deeper, more existential dread. She was a ghost in her own life, haunted by a past she never understood and hunted by enemies she had never met. And her only protector was the enigmatic, unreadable stranger, sleeping just a few yards away, the sovereign of her gilded cage. Emma woke to the unfamiliar weight of daylight. For a disoriented moment she was adrift in a sea of ivory linen, the scent of lavender and old money filling her senses. Then memory returned, not as a gentle wave, but as a tidal force pulling her under. The wedding, the locked door, the revelation. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wedding dress was a wrinkled, suffocating cage around her. Across the room, the couch was empty. The cashmere blanket was folded with military precision and placed over the armrest. The pillow was gone. There was no sign that Richard Sterling had ever been there, save for the indentation his body had left on the velvet cushions, a faint ghost of his presence. He had left as silently as he had lived beside her through the night. A soft chime, melodic and unobtrusive, sounded from a small, discreet panel on the wall near the door. A moment later, a woman in a simple charcoal-gray uniform entered without knocking. She was middle-aged, her face a placid mask of professional deference. She carried a tray laden with a silver coffee pot, a porcelain cup, and a single perfect croissant. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling." The the woman said, her voice soft and even. "My name is Anya. I am the head of the household staff. Mr. Sterling has instructed that your breakfast be served here should you prefer. A full selection is also available in the dining solarium." The name Mrs. Sterling sent another shiver down Emma's spine. It was a brand, a designation. It did not feel like her own. "Thank you, Anya," Emma managed, her voice hoarse. Anya set the tray down on a small table by the window. "A wardrobe has been prepared for you in the dressing room," she added, gesturing to an adjoining door. "Should the selections not be to your liking, a personal shopper can be arranged for this afternoon." With a slight, respectful bow, Anya turned and left the door, closing with a whisper behind her. Emma was alone again in the opulent silence. She slipped out of bed, the crumpled silk of her gown whispering against her skin. In the dressing room, a walk-in closet larger than her old bedroom racks of clothes awaited her. Simple, elegant pieces in muted tones: cashmere sweaters, tailored trousers, silk blouses, soft leather shoes. It was a uniform for a life of quiet luxury, chosen by a stranger for a stranger. There was nothing of her in it. No worn-out jeans, no favorite faded t-shirts, no connection to the girl she had been just yesterday. She showered in a bathroom of seamless marble and chrome, the water pressure a testament to meticulous engineering. She dressed in a pair of gray trousers and a cream-colored sweater that felt sinfully soft against her skin. The clothes were a perfect fit. Of course they were. Every detail in this new life was perfect, calculated, and cold. Forcing herself to eat the croissant and drink the coffee, she felt a flicker of defiance. She would not hide in this room. This was her prison, and a prisoner ought to know the layout of her cell. As she stepped out of the bedroom suite, a man was waiting for her in the hallway. He was tall and lean, with a stillness that reminded her instantly of Richard. But where Richard's stillness was one of thought, this man's was one of coiled readiness. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, but it did nothing to soften the hard lines of his face or the alert, assessing look in his eyes. He had the distinct air of a man who was both armed and profoundly dangerous. "Mrs. Sterling," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of inflection. "My name is Marcus. I am Mr. Sterling's head of security. I will be your primary point of contact." He was Richard's proxy, his warden. "Contact for what?" Emma asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Marcus's expression did not flicker. "For your safety and daily arrangements. Mr. Sterling is occupied with business for the foreseeable future. He has instructed me to acclimate you to the estate and its protocols." Protocols. The word hung in the air between them, clinical and chilling. "I will show you the grounds." He continued, turning to walk down the grand floating staircase that dominated the central hall. Emma had no choice but to follow. The mansion was an architectural marvel of glass, steel, and pale stone. It was less a home and more a private museum. Sunlight poured through vast two-story windows, illuminating minimalist furniture, abstract sculptures, and walls hung with modern art that was impressive but emotionally sterile. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine. There was no clutter, no sign of messy everyday life. It was a space designed to be looked at, not lived in. "The estate covers 200 acres, Marcus explained as he led her through the main floor. "It is bordered by a perimeter wall equipped with seismic motion and thermal sensors. The grounds are patrolled by a rotating security detail, and the house itself is monitored at all times." He said it all with the flat affect of a man listing the features of a high-end appliance. He was telling her she was protected, but all Emma heard was that she was under constant surveillance. "You have unrestricted access to the main house, the gardens, the library, the gymnasium, and the indoor pool," he listed. "The West Wing is currently sealed for renovations. Access is restricted." They stepped outside onto a sprawling stone terrace that overlooked the gardens. The view was breathtaking. Rolling lawns flowed down to a serene man-made lake. Hedges were trimmed into perfect geometric shapes. Flower beds bloomed with disciplined riots of color. It was beautiful, but it was a controlled, artificial beauty. Nature tamed and bent to a billionaire's will. "Am I allowed to leave the estate?" Emma asked, testing the limits of her cage. "Not at this time," Marcus replied without hesitation. "It is not secure. All your needs will be met here. Any requests you have can be made through me." He was a gatekeeper, a human wall. She looked at him, at his impassive face and watchful eyes, and knew that arguing would be as pointless as shouting at a mountain. For the rest of the morning, she wandered the designated zones of her new world. The library was magnificent, filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes, but it felt like a showroom. She ran her fingers along the spines, yet felt no connection to the stories within. The silence was too profound, the air too still. Late in the afternoon, her restless exploration led her down a long, quiet corridor she hadn't seen before. It was darker here, the glass walls replaced by cool, solid stone. At the end of the hall was a single heavy door made of dark, aged oak. It was completely different from the modern, minimalist design of the rest of the house. It had an old-fashioned wrought iron handle and a large mechanical lock. This had to be it. The entrance to the restricted west wing. A small electronic keypad was mounted on the wall beside it, its screen dark. She reached for the handle. It was cold, immovable. She pushed against the heavy wood, but it was like pushing against the side of a mountain. It was sealed, locked, forbidden. Why, what was in there that Richard needed to hide renovations? Marcus had said. It was a lie. She could feel it. This door was not protecting a construction site. It was guarding a secret. A new obsession took root in her mind, a single focal point for all her fear and frustration. She needed to know what was behind that door. Later, as evening bled across the sky, she stood on a balcony overlooking the gardens. The scent of rain was on the air, a cool, earthy smell that reminded her of home, of before. The scent was a key unlocking a memory that slammed into her with the force of a physical impact. She is in the back of the car, the scent of rain and wet asphalt filling the air. Her father is driving her mother in the passenger seat. They are laughing about something, a joke Emma didn't quite hear. Her father glances in the rearview mirror, and his smile vanishes. His hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Hold on," he says, his voice suddenly tight with an emotion she can't name. Her mother turns to look at him, her own expression shifting from joy to confusion, then to alarm. Emma follows her father's gaze in the mirror and sees them. Headlights. A large, dark sedan moving too fast, closing the distance between them with predatory speed. It wasn't just another car. It was hunting them. Then the screech of tires, the horrifying metallic scream of the impact from behind the world, spinning in a vortex of breaking glass, and her mother's final sharp cry of her name. Emma gasped, stumbling back against the railing of the balcony, her hand flying to her mouth. The memory was so vivid, so real. The dark sedan. It hadn't been in the police report. The report had said her father lost control on a slick patch of road, that he had overcorrected and hit a tree. There was no mention of another vehicle. They had lied, or the truth had been buried. Richard's story wasn't a paranoid fantasy. It was real. The accident wasn't an accident. It was an attack. The fragmented memory was the proof, a piece of the puzzle that had been locked away in the trauma of her own mind. A sound from above made her look up. A sleek black helicopter was descending, landing silently on a helipad she hadn't noticed on the far side of the roof. A few minutes later, Richard Sterling emerged from a side door dressed in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase. He didn't look in her direction. He walked across the lawn to the waiting aircraft, his stride purposeful and commanding. He was a king in his domain, a man who moved mountains and controlled the sky. He was leaving. She watched as the helicopter lifted off its rotors, slicing through the twilight air. He was a ghost in this house, a distant, powerful force controlling her life from afar. And he had secrets. Secrets that were locked away just like her. Her gaze drifted back along the stone facade of the mansion until it rested on the dark, impenetrable windows of the West Wing. The memory of the crash, the reality of her parents' murder had not broken her. It had forged her fear into something harder. Resolve. This mansion was a puzzle. Richard Sterling was an enigma, and she was now certain that the key to understanding what had truly happened to her parents was waiting for her behind that single locked door. Days bled into one another, each one a perfect, sterile copy of the last. Emma's life fell into a rhythm dictated by the silent efficiency of the estate. She woke. She dressed in the clothes of a stranger. She ate alone in sun-drenched rooms, and she walked the flawless gardens until the paths became as familiar as the lines on her own hands. Richard Sterling remained a phantom. She would sometimes catch a glimpse of his helicopter lifting off in the morning, or returning at dusk, a remote god commuting from his Olympus. He never sought her out. Her world was managed by Marcus and the quiet, ever-present staff. But his absence was not an empty space. It was a palpable presence, a constant, unseen pressure. She felt his influence in everything, a grandmaster moving invisible pieces on a board where she was the captive queen. The first move was in the library. During one of her long, aimless afternoons, she wandered into the vast two-story rotunda of books. She had been avoiding it, the quiet reverence of the place, a painful reminder of her father, who had lived and breathed the scent of old paper and ink. Today, driven by a desperate need for distraction, she began to browse the fiction shelves. As her fingers traced the leather spines, she froze. Tucked away in an alcove she hadn't noticed before was an entire section dedicated to her most obscure passion, early 20th century female travel writers. Not just the famous ones, but rare first editions of authors she had written papers on in her first year of college. It was too niche, too specific to be a coincidence. Someone had researched her. Someone had curated this shelf specifically for her. The discovery did not comfort her. It felt like a violation, as if a stranger had rummaged through the private drawers of her mind. The second move came a few nights later. The scent hit her first, a warm, familiar aroma of baked apples and cinnamon that stopped her in her tracks on the main staircase. It was the smell of her childhood of Sunday evenings, when her mother would bake her favorite dessert. When Anya served dinner in the small formal dining room, she presented the final course with a quiet flourish. Apple crumble. It was not just any apple crumble. The topping was perfectly crisp, the apples tart, but tender, the hint of nutmeg, exactly as she remembered. It was her mother's recipe. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek before she could stop it. The taste was an act of exquisite cruelty, a memory of love served on a cold silver platter. She pushed the dish away, the perfect recreation, a reminder of all that was irrecoverably lost. The third and perhaps most significant move was delivered by Marcus. He found her on the terrace the following morning, staring out at the manicured perfection of the estate. "Mr. Sterling has instructed me to inform you that the walled garden is now at your disposal." He said, his tone as flat as ever. He handed her a single ornate iron key. "It is a private space. You will not be disturbed there." Following his directions, she found a high stone wall covered in ancient ivy, with a small, unassuming wooden door set within it. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door opened into a world of untamed beauty. Unlike the rest of the grounds, this garden was a wild, romantic tangle of climbing roses, lavender bushes, and overgrown pathways that led to a moss-covered stone bench beside a trickling fountain. It was a secret, hidden place, beautiful and secluded. A gift. But Emma knew it for what it was, a more beautiful corner of her cage. These were not acts of kindness. They were strategies. He was studying her, learning her triggers, her intellectual passions, her emotional vulnerabilities, her need for a sliver of privacy. He was furnishing her prison with pieces of her own soul to make her more comfortable, more compliant. The realization solidified her fear and grief into a cold, hard anger. She was not a project to be managed. She was not a pet to be pacified with treats. That evening she waited for him. She sat in a chair in the grand hall watching the sky darken, ignoring Anya's polite inquiries about dinner. She heard the distant thrum of the helicopter and saw its lights descend toward the house. She waited, her heart a cold, steady drum against her ribs. She saw him enter through a side entrance, Marcus at his side. He had shed his suit jacket and was loosening his tie as he spoke in low tones to his security chief. He looked tired, the hard lines of his face etched with the pressures of his day. For a fleeting moment she felt a pang of something she refused to name. Then he looked up and saw her. His steps did not falter. He dismissed Marcus with a curt nod and walked directly toward her. "Emma," he said. He had never used her first name before. It sounded strange in his voice. "We need to talk," she said, rising from her chair. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his otherwise impassive features. "Very well. My study." He led the way to a part of the house she had not yet seen. His study was not like the library. It was a modern command center, all clean lines, dark wood, and integrated technology. A massive desk faced a wall of glass that overlooked the glittering city skyline. This was the heart of his empire, the throne from which he moved the world. He stood behind his desk, a king in his castle, and gestured for her to take one of the chairs opposite him. She remained standing. "The books," she began, her voice tight. "The dessert, the garden. What is this?" He showed no confusion. "I am providing for your comfort." "You are managing an asset," she shot back. "You are studying my file, learning my weaknesses, and using my own memories to make me docile. I am not a frightened animal you can tame." He regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "It is my responsibility to ensure your well-being. That includes your psychological state. A mind under siege is not a healthy one. I am providing you with familiar comforts to mitigate the stress of your situation." His cold, logical explanation was more infuriating than any denial. "My situation," she scoffed, taking a step closer to the desk. "You mean the fact that my parents were murdered? I remember it now, you know. I remember the car that ran us off the road. The car that wasn't in any police report." The muscle in his jaw tightened. It was the only sign that her words had registered. "You were right," she pressed on, fueled by his silence. "They were killed. Now I want the truth. Not your carefully managed parcels of information. All of it. Who are these people? What is this research they're after? What was my father building?" He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The picture of calm control. "I have already told you what you need to know." "You have told me nothing," she cried, her control finally snapping. "You have locked me away and told me to be a good, ignorant little girl. I will not live in the dark while the ghosts of my parents are screaming for answers." He rose from his chair, his height and presence suddenly filling the room, pushing the air out. He moved around the desk until he stood directly in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of gray in his otherwise dark eyes. He was not angry. He was something far more unnerving, utterly resolute. "You misunderstand the nature of your position," he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "This is not a negotiation. It is a matter of your survival. The people who killed your father are not simple criminals. They are a global corporation with resources that rival those of most nations. They are called Omnicorp. They do not leave loose ends." The name landed like a stone in the pit of her stomach. Omnicorp. It sounded powerful, untouchable. "What you perceive as me, keeping you in the dark." He continued, his gaze pinning her in place. "Is me keeping you alive. Specific knowledge formulas, schematics, access codes makes you a target. It makes you a resource to be captured and exploited. Right now, to them, you are a lockbox without a key. They believe you have subconscious knowledge or a hidden trigger, but they cannot be sure. My strategy is to maintain that uncertainty." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping even further. "The less you know, the safer you are. If you are captured and questioned, you cannot give them what you do not have. Your ignorance is your shield, Emma. It is the strongest piece of armor I can give you." His words were a cold, brutal logic that she could not argue against, and she hated him for it. She hated the way he said her name, the way he made her feel like a child, the way he was so completely and utterly in control. She was a pawn in his game, a precious piece to be protected, but a pawn nonetheless. The air between them was electric, charged with her fury and his unyielding authority. In the silence that followed, she became aware of other things: the subtle scent of expensive cologne and clean linen, the warmth radiating from his body, the sheer physical power he held in reserve. Underneath her anger, a different, more confusing current began to swirl, a grudging acknowledgement of his strength, a terrifying flicker of attraction to the very force that held her captive. She broke the gaze first, taking a step back, needing the space to breathe. "So I am to remain here, a well-cared-for prisoner, fed memories and allowed to walk in a pretty garden until when?" "Until I have finished what your father started," he said. "Until I have dismantled Omnicorp from the inside out. Until the threat is neutralized. Permanently." There was no doubt in his voice. It was a statement of fact, a promise. Emma turned and walked toward the door, her legs unsteady. She had her answers, but they gave her no peace. She had a name for her enemy and a protector in her keeper. The lines were so blurred she could no longer tell where the cage ended and the sanctuary began. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and looked back at him. He had not moved. He stood like a statue in the heart of his kingdom, watching her. "I am not your pawn, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but firm. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "No," he agreed. "You are the reason for the war." A fragile, unspoken truce settled over the mansion in the days following their confrontation. Richard remained a distant star in her sky, visible but unreachable. They would occasionally pass in the long sunlit corridors, and he would incline his head with a cool, formal nod. The charged energy that had crackled between them in his study had retreated, replaced by a quiet, mutual assessment. Emma no longer saw him as a simple monster or a benevolent captor. She saw him as a chess master, his mind constantly working on a game whose rules she was only beginning to understand. Her anger had not vanished, but it had changed its shape. It was no longer a wild, thrashing thing, but a cold, focused point of light in the darkness of her confusion. She spent her hours in the walled garden, the untamed beauty of the place a balm to her spirit. It was there, amidst the scent of damp earth and climbing roses, that she felt the ghost of her old self, the girl who loved books and quiet contemplation. But that girl was gone, and in her place was a woman learning the art of survival. The serpent arrived on a Tuesday. Marcus delivered the news with his usual stoicism. He found her by the fountain in the walled garden, a book lying unread in her lap. "Your aunt and uncle have requested a visit," he stated, his presence a sudden shadow in her sanctuary. "They will be arriving at 3 o'clock. Emma's blood ran cold. "What?" She stood up, the book tumbling to the mossy stones. Why would he allow them here?" "Mr. Sterling approved the request," was all Marcus said, his face a mask. He was a soldier following orders, not a man to be questioned. Dread, thick and suffocating, settled over her. Walter and Helen, here, in this place. It felt like a contamination, a violation of the fragile peace she had begun to carve out for herself. Why would Richard permit it after everything he had told her? Why would he let the very people who had betrayed her walk through his gates? She could only assume it was another move in his game, another calculated play she couldn't comprehend. At precisely 3 o'clock, she was waiting in the grand salon, a vast, impersonal room with silk-paneled walls and furniture that looked too beautiful to be sat upon. She had chosen her clothes with care, a simple black dress, severe and elegant. She would give them no sign of weakness, no hint of the terrified girl they had sold. Richard was there, standing by the tall windows that overlooked the entrance, his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a dark gray suit that seemed to absorb the light, making him look like a figure carved from shadow and steel. He had not spoken a word to her since entering the room, but his presence was a tangible shield. She saw the car, then a modest rental that looked utterly pathetic, as it crunched to a halt on the pristine gravel of the circular driveway. Walter and Helen emerged, looking small and distinctly out of place. Helen clutched her handbag like a weapon, her eyes darting everywhere, a mixture of awe and resentment on her pinched face. Walter, trying to project an air of nonchalant confidence, squared his shoulders and smoothed his cheap suit jacket. They looked like crows who had wandered into an eagle's eyrie. Anya showed them in. The moment Helen saw Emma, she rushed forward, her arms outstretched, a brittle, theatrical smile plastered on her face. "Emma, my dear, oh, look at you, we were so worried." Emma stood her ground, allowing the embrace but not returning it. Helen's perfume was cloying her touch, as cold as a snake's skin. "I'm fine, Aunt Helen," Emma said, her voice even. Walter hovered behind his wife, his gaze fixed on Richard. There was fear in her uncle's eyes, a deep, primal fear that he was trying to hide behind a blustering facade. "Sterling," he said, offering a hand that Richard ignored. "Good of you to let us see our niece. Just wanted to make sure she was settling in." "She is," Richard said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the room. He did not move from his position by the window, forcing them to stand awkwardly in the center of the vast space. He was making it clear who held all the power. They sat, the conversation stilted and false. Helen asked a stream of vapid questions about the house, her words dripping with a syrupy blend of envy and feigned concern. "Is he good to you, dear? This is all so grand. You must be terribly lonely. I have everything I need." Emma replied, her answers clipped and non-committal. She could feel her aunts probing her attempts to find a crack in the facade, a weakness she could exploit. Walter, meanwhile, kept trying to engage Richard, talking about markets and business in a desperate attempt to appear as an equal. Richard answered with monosyllabic replies, his disinterest a weapon in itself. "You must remember, Emma," Walter said, turning his attention to her. his tone shifting to one of oily paternalism. "That everything we did for you. To secure your future. We made sacrifices." The lie was so audacious it almost made her laugh. She looked at this man, her father's brother, and felt nothing but a cold, bottomless contempt. The sacrifices he spoke of were her life, her freedom. "I should get some tea," Emma said, needing to escape the suffocating poison of their presence. She rose and left the salon, the murmur of their voices fading behind her. Instead of going to the kitchen, she walked down the cool stone corridor toward Richard's study. A reckless impulse born of anger and a desperate need for truth guided her feet. As she drew near, she heard voices from within. Raised voices. The door was slightly ajar. She slowed her heart pounding and pressed herself against the cold wall to listen. It was Walter's voice, stripped of its bluster, now thin and reedy with panic. "This wasn't the deal, Sterling. You were supposed to keep them away from me, Omnicorp. They're still asking questions. They know she's here." "That is no longer my concern." Richard's voice was like ice. "You made your bed when you decided to sell your niece. You are useful to me now only as a conduit of misinformation. Nothing more. Do not forget your place, Dawson." "My place?" Walter's voice cracked. "They'll kill me. And for what? So you can play protector. You're as trapped as I am. You think this fortress of yours makes you untouchable. They have eyes everywhere. They'll burn it to the ground to get to her and you with it." A heavy silence followed. Emma held her breath, expecting an explosion of anger from Richard. Instead, his voice, when it came, was lethally calm. "Then I suppose you had better hope my fortress is as strong as I believe it to be. Your survival now depends entirely on mine. Now get out." Emma scrambled back from the door, her mind reeling. She hurried back toward the salon, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. Trapped. Walter had said Richard was trapped too. For the first time it occurred to her that Richard's power, as immense as it was, might have its limits. That he was not just a player in this game, but a target. When she re-entered the salon, a silent Anya was already serving tea. Walter and Helen were on their feet, preparing to leave. The pretense of a friendly visit had evaporated. Helen's face was a mask of pure venom, while Walter looked pale and shaken. He wouldn't meet Emma's eyes. She walked them to the door, Richard a silent sentinel behind her. As they stepped out onto the gravel, Helen turned and grabbed Emma's arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "Don't get too comfortable, little girl," she hissed, her voice low and vicious. "Men like him get tired of their toys. When he throws you away, don't come crawling back to us." Emma pulled her arm free, her gaze cold. "Goodbye, Helen." She watched them get into their pathetic little car and speed away, leaving a trail of dust and ill will in their wake. When the car was gone, the silence they left behind was vast and heavy. She turned to find Richard watching her, his expression unreadable. "I heard you," she said, the words coming out before she could think. "You and Walter, in the study." He didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. He walked past her back into the house. "Come," he said over his shoulder. She followed him back to his study. He went to the wall of glass and stood there for a long time, staring out at the darkening landscape. The mask of impenetrable control had slipped just for a moment, and in its place she saw a profound weariness, the deep soul-crushing strain of a man fighting a war on 1,000 fronts. "Your uncle was contacted by an agent from Omnicorp 1 week after your parents' funeral," he said, his voice quiet, tired. "They offered him a generous financial package and a guarantee of his and your aunt's safety, in exchange for you. He informed them of your location on 3 separate occasions. The last time was the day before our wedding. He told them where you would be fitted for your dress." The betrayal was so cold, so absolute, it stole her breath. "I allowed today's visit for a specific reason," he continued, turning to face her. "During his tirade, I allowed a piece of false information to be overheard by one of their surveillance assets. They now believe the final component of your father's research is in a Swiss vault. It will send them on a wild goose chase for a few months. It buys us time." He was using everyone, even his enemies, even the man who had sold her out. The sheer audacity and cold calculation of his mind was both terrifying and brilliant. "He said you were trapped." Emma whispered, the words hanging in the air between them. A flicker of something vulnerability perhaps crossed his features before being suppressed. "The war I am fighting is not without risk," he admitted. "Omnicorp is a cancer. Cutting it out is a complicated and dangerous surgery. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she felt he was seeing not an asset, not a responsibility, but a person. An ally, however unwilling. "I need you to understand," he said, his voice low and intense. "The people who just left this house are not your family. They are your enemies. As dangerous as any agent Omnicorp could send. Never trust them. Never speak to them. Never forget what they did." She wouldn't. The last vestiges of any childhood attachment to her aunt and uncle withered and died in that moment, turning to ash. All she felt now was a cold, hard resolve. Her world had been stripped down to this one undeniable truth. The only person in the entire world who wanted her alive was the cold, calculating, and dangerously powerful man standing before her. And as she looked at him, seeing the immense weight he carried on her behalf, a new and unsettling emotion stirred within her. Not gratitude, not yet, but a flicker of empathy, a fragile, tentative thread of connection to her keeper, her protector, her king in this gilded war. The knowledge of her uncle's betrayal did not break Emma. It tempered her. The last fragile link to her past, to the illusion of family, had been incinerated. She was adrift, but she was no longer drowning in grief. A cold, hard clarity had taken its place. She was a player in a war she hadn't chosen, and her protector was a king whose strategies were as complex and dangerous as the enemy he fought. Her focus, her entire being, narrowed to a single point: the locked oak door at the end of the West Wing corridor. It was more than just a locked room. It was the heart of the mystery, the place where Richard's secrets and her father's ghost converged. Marcus's lie about renovations was laughably thin. That door guarded something vital, and Emma knew with an instinct she was beginning to trust that she could not move forward until she knew what it was. She began her campaign with subtlety. She spent hours in the library poring over books on architecture and security systems, hoping for a clue. She watched the movements of the staff, trying to discern if any of them ever accessed the forbidden wing. They did not. The corridor leading to it remained a silent, untouched artery of the house. The lock itself became her obsession. It was an old, beautiful piece of iron craftsmanship, a stark contrast to the invisible electronic security that blanketed the rest of the estate. The keyhole was large, mechanical. It was an anachronism, and therefore it had to be a deliberate choice. A weakness, or a different kind of strength. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. He had been a man who loved to take things apart to understand them. "Every system has a flaw, M," he used to say, tinkering with a broken clock on the kitchen table. "You just have to find the point of least resistance." The point of least resistance. The thought sparked an idea. She didn't need a key. She needed ingenuity. Her search for tools was discreet. In a forgotten drawer in one of the many opulent but unused guest suites, she found a small sewing kit. Inside, among the spools of thread, were several sturdy needles. Later, in a home office stocked with fine stationery, she slipped a pair of thin, strong metal paperclips into her pocket. They felt heavy, illicit, the instruments of her quiet rebellion. For 3 consecutive nights after the house had fallen into its deep, managed silence, she slipped out of her room and went to the door. Kneeling on the cold stone floor, using the faint light from her phone, she worked. Her fingers, at first clumsy and unsure, grew steady. She remembered diagrams she had seen online, the simple mechanics of pin-tumbler locks. The first needle was too brittle. It snapped. The paperclips were better. She bent one into a tension wrench, the other into a pick. It was painstaking work. Hours melted away, marked only by the silent, sweeping patrols of the security lights across the distant lawns. There was a rhythm to it, a conversation between her fingers and the metal pins inside the lock. And with every failed attempt, her resolve hardened. This was the first choice she had made, the first act of true agency she had taken since her life had been stolen from her. On the 3rd night, it happened. A tiny, almost imperceptible click followed by another. She held her breath, applying gentle pressure with the tension wrench. She felt a final soft tumbler give way. The lock turned. The sound was a small metallic sigh in the vast silence. Her heart leaped into her throat. For a moment she was paralyzed by a new fear, the fear of what she might find. Pushing it down, she slowly, carefully turned the heavy iron handle. The door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, opening into a darkness that smelled of dust, old paper, and something else. Something achingly familiar. She slipped inside, closing the door gently behind her, and used her phone's light to find a switch on the wall. Soft, warm light filled the space, and Emma's breath caught in a sob. It was her father's study, not a replica, not an imitation. It was his study. The same scuffed mahogany desk, the same worn leather armchair with the crack in the left armrest. The same chaotic constellation of books and papers, the towering shelves filled with volumes on physics and engineering. The scent, a unique blend of coffee, sawdust, and old books, was his scent. It was the smell of her childhood, of safety, of him. She walked forward as if in a dream, her fingers trailing over the familiar surfaces. There on the corner of the desk was the ridiculous bobblehead figure of Albert Einstein she had given him for his birthday one year. There was the chipped ceramic mug from his university filled with his favorite pens. It was all here, every detail perfect, every object a ghost. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. This was not a memorial. A memorial was a cold, public thing. This was a resurrection. Someone had painstakingly recreated this space piece by piece. But as she moved deeper into the room, she began to notice things that were not ghosts. On a large whiteboard against the far wall, a complex series of equations was scrawled, half erased and rewritten. The handwriting was not her father's elegant script. It was sharper, more aggressive. On the desk next to a stack of her father's familiar dog-eared notebooks lay a sleek, modern tablet computer, its screen glowing with a 3D schematic of a complex energy core. This was not a shrine. It was a laboratory, an active workshop. Someone was continuing her father's work. A soft sound from the doorway made her spin around, her heart seizing with panic. Richard Sterling stood there. He was not wearing a suit, but a simple dark sweater and trousers. He was not angry. His face, in the warm light of the study, was stripped of its usual impenetrable mask. In its place was a deep, quiet sorrow. He looked at her, then at the room around them, and a look of profound shared grief passed between them. "I knew you would find your way here eventually," he said. His voice was different. The hard corporate edge was gone, replaced by a quiet human weariness. "What is this?" she whispered, her hand gesturing to the impossible perfect room. This is his ghost. Why?" He walked slowly into the room, his eyes scanning the space with a familiarity that spoke of countless hours spent within these walls. "It's all I have left of him," he said simply. He stopped in front of the worn armchair and ran a hand over the cracked leather. "Your father, David. He wasn't just a man I invested in, Emma. He was the most brilliant mind I ever encountered. And he was my friend." The word friend changed everything. It recontextualized every action, every cold calculation, every wall he had built around her. "We met years ago." Richard continued, his gaze lost in memory. He had a theory, a vision for a world free of fossil fuels, powered by a clean, limitless energy source. Everyone else called him a dreamer. I called him a revolutionary. I gave him the resources, the labs, the freedom to create. This, he gestured to the schematics on the tablet. This was his life's work. Our life's work. Emma stared at him, seeing him for the first time, not as a billionaire or a captor, but as a man who had lost someone he loved. The night of the accident. Richard's voice grew rough, with an emotion he did not try to hide. We had made a breakthrough, a final critical step. The working prototype of the energy core was in the car with them. It was small, no bigger than a suitcase. They were bringing it to a secure facility. I was supposed to be with them. A conference call from Tokyo ran late. I told them to go on ahead, that I would meet them there. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a raw, agonizing guilt. If I had been in that car, maybe my security detail could have stopped them. Maybe I could have done something. It's the question I've lived with every day since. He walked over to the desk and picked up one of her father's notebooks. Omnicorp didn't just kill my friend. They tried to kill the future. They took the prototype, but they didn't get the research notes or the activation keys. David was too smart for that. The core of his work was fragmented, hidden. When I realized what your uncle was planning, I had to act. But this wasn't just about protecting you, Emma. It was about protecting his legacy. He looked around the perfect, impossible room. I had all of his possessions moved from your old house before it was sold. I rebuilt his study here because I needed it. I needed to be surrounded by his process, his chaos, his genius, to even begin to try and piece together what we lost. I'm trying to rebuild it, Emma. For him, for the world he wanted to create. The confession settled in the quiet space between them, profound and irrevocable. His distance, his control, his obsession, it was all born from a crucible of grief and duty. He hadn't built a prison for her. He had built a sanctuary for her father's dream, and he had locked himself inside it with her. She looked from the heartbreakingly familiar room to the man standing in the center of it, a man who had carried this immense burden alone. The last of her suspicion, the last of her anger dissolved, washed away by a sudden, overwhelming wave of understanding. He was not her keeper. He was the keeper of her father's legacy. And in that moment, she realized with startling clarity that she was no longer just a protected asset or a pawn in his game. She was the only other person in the world who understood the ghost in this room. They were not protector and protected. They were partners bound together by the brilliant, tragic legacy of the man they had both loved. The confession hung in the air of the resurrected study, a truth so profound it seemed to alter the very atoms in the room. Emma looked at Richard at the raw grief and guilt etched onto his face, and the last of her fear withered into dust. He was not an enemy. He was a fellow mourner, the sole guardian of a legacy she hadn't known existed. She did not leave the study. To leave would have been to abandon not just him, but the ghost of her father that lived so vividly within these walls. Instead, she took a step forward, her fingers tracing the faded cover of a notebook on the desk. He used a Billionaire cipher for his most important notes. She said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. Based on a key phrase from my mother's favorite poem. I know the key. Richard looked up, his exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of sharp, focused intensity. He had been trying to brute force the encryption on some of his partner's digital files for months with no success. He had assumed it was a complex algorithmic key. He had never considered it would be something so deeply personal. That was the moment the dynamic shifted irrevocably. It was the moment she crossed the threshold from protected asset to invaluable partner. The days that followed took on a new intense rhythm. The vast, sterile mansion ceased to be her world. The West Wing study became her universe. They would work for hours that stretched into days, fueled by coffee and a shared burning purpose. The rest of the house became a place for the necessities of life, sleep, food, showers, before they were drawn back to the controlled chaos of their work. Anya would leave trays of food outside the study door, which they would often forget until the coffee grew cold. Marcus, when he saw them, would simply nod, his expression unreadable, but Emma sensed a change in his demeanor. He no longer looked at her as a fragile charge to be monitored, but with a new quiet respect. She was no longer just the principal, she was part of the command. Their collaboration was a strange, intricate dance of two minds. Richard possessed the breadth of scientific knowledge, the understanding of the universal principles at play. He could look at an equation and see the shape of the cosmos. But Emma held the key to the unique language of her father's genius. No, he wouldn't have used a standard alloy for the containment field, she would say, pointing at a complex schematic on the large monitor. He was obsessed with biomimicry. He once spent a week trying to replicate the energy efficiency of a firefly's bioluminescence. Look in his notes under Project Lampiridea. Richard would search the archived files, and there, buried in pages of seemingly unrelated observations, would be the missing formula, a bioresonant ceramic composite that was orders of magnitude stronger than any traditional alloy. They worked side by side at the large desk, the space between them shrinking from a careful, deliberate distance to a comfortable proximity. Their hands would brush as they reached for the same document, a jolt of unexpected electricity passing between them. He would lean over her shoulder to look at a line of code she had deciphered, his clean, masculine scent enveloping her, making it momentarily difficult to concentrate. The age gap, the 30 years that had seemed like an insurmountable chasm, began to feel irrelevant. In the crucible of their shared work, they were simply two minds, two souls, focused on a single point. He stopped seeing her as the frightened 19-year-old girl he had married and began to see the fierce intelligence and unwavering resilience of the woman she was becoming. She, in turn, began to see past the intimidating billionaire and glimpse the brilliant, dedicated, and lonely man beneath. The true bonding happened in the quiet moments between the work. In the deep hours of the night when their minds were exhausted, they would talk. He drove my mother crazy with his absent-mindedness, Emma said one night, a soft, reminiscent smile on her face. She was curled in the worn leather armchair, a mug of tea warming her hands. He once tried to make toast by putting bread in the DVD player. He was convinced he could invent a better, more efficient way to heat the bread. Richard, standing by the whiteboard, paused his work. A low sound rumbled in his chest, and then it happened, a genuine, unrestrained laugh. It was a rich, warm sound that startled them both. He looked at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and the last of the intimidating titan vanished, replaced by a man sharing a fond memory. He once tried to convince me we could solve the energy crisis using potatoes. Richard countered, a ghost of a smile lingering on his lips. We had a ferocious argument. He threw a potato at my head. 2 days later, he came back with 17 pages of equations, proving it was in fact theoretically possible if you had a potato the size of the moon. They laughed together, and the sound filled the quiet study, chasing away the ghosts for a little while. They were sharing him, building a bridge between their separate griefs. One evening, they hit a wall. A crucial data file was corrupted, a key piece of the design for the energy core's regulator. Without it, all their work was theoretical. Richard worked for hours, his frustration mounting, the lines around his eyes deepening. Finally, he leaned back, running a hand through his iron-gray hair in a rare show of defeat. "It's no good," he said, his voice flat. "The primary file is gone, and the backup is encrypted with a key I can't break." Emma came to stand behind him, looking at the string of nonsensical code on the screen. "Let me try something," she said quietly. She remembered a conversation, a story her father had told her about how he met her mother. He had passed her a note in a university library, a simple question written in a code he had invented on the spot. "What was my mother's maiden name?" she asked. Richard looked at her, confused. "Archer." Emma typed Archer into the decryption field. Nothing. "What was the name of the library?" "The Blackwood." She typed Blackwood Archer. The screen flickered. Access denied. She thought for a moment longer. Her father was a romantic, but he was also a logician. He asked her for coffee, she murmured to herself. She said yes. She typed Blackwood Archeries. The screen went blank for a heartbeat, then flooded with lines of cascading data. Schematics, equations, and notes filled the monitor. The corrupted file was restored. They stared at the screen, stunned into silence. They had done it. It was the key, the linchpin they had been missing for months. How? Richard breathed, turning in his chair to look up at her. His face was illuminated by the soft glow of the monitor, and in his eyes she saw a look of such profound awe and admiration that it stole her breath. He loved her, Emma whispered, her throat tight with emotion. His greatest secrets were always protected by his greatest love. The tension, the exhaustion, the shared frustration, and now this sudden, stunning victory created a powerful emotional vortex in the small space between them. He slowly rose from his chair, never taking his eyes off her. The elation of their breakthrough was mingling with a different, more fragile energy. "Your father would be so proud of you," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "He would be proud of us," she corrected softly. He was standing directly in front of her now. The intellectual intimacy they had forged over late nights and impossible problems had reached its flashpoint, ready to become something more. He reached out, his movements hesitant, and his fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was warm, electric. It was not the impersonal touch of their wedding day, nor the calculated gesture of a keeper. It was the touch of a man seeing a woman for the very first time. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. All the walls, all the defenses, all the carefully constructed boundaries between them crumbled to dust. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion or demand. It was a question, a soft, hesitant exploration. It tasted of late-night coffee, of shared grief, and of a fragile, terrifying hope. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of mutual respect, of two lonely, shipwrecked souls finding a safe harbor in each other. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palms. His own hands moved to her waist, holding her gently, as if she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. When they finally pulled apart, the air in the room had changed. The study was no longer just a workshop. Their partnership was no longer just about their work. A new, unspoken truth lay between them, delicate and shimmering. They stared at each other, the silence filled with the weight of that single gentle kiss. And both of them knew that the nature of their alliance had just been fundamentally and dangerously transformed. The kiss lingered in the quiet spaces between them. It was a ghost on their lips in the early mornings, a silent acknowledgement across a desk laden with blueprints, a soft, unspoken question in the deep hours of the night. Their partnership in the study deepened, but it was now threaded with a fragile, terrifying intimacy. The air between them hummed with a new electricity, a tenderness that had not been there before. They had not spoken of it. To put words to the delicate, shimmering thing that was growing between them felt like it might shatter it. Instead, they communicated in a new language, in the way he would place a fresh cup of coffee on her desk without interrupting her work, in the way she would gently place a hand on his arm when she saw the exhaustion settling into the lines around his eyes. They were two solitary planets that had drifted into a shared orbit, and the gravitational pull was becoming undeniable. This newfound peace made the intrusion when it came all the more violent. It began with a message. Richard was in his main office one morning when an encrypted communication flashed across one of his monitors. Emma, who had brought him a folder of her father's translated notes, saw his posture stiffen, his entire body going rigid. The brief warmth that had entered his expression when she came in was gone, replaced by the cold, hard mask of the strategist. "What is it?" she asked, her own sense of peace evaporating like morning mist. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the lines of code. "The misdirection in Switzerland has run its course," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Omnicorp has realized they were played. Their intelligence chatter has intensified. They're no longer searching for a location. They're searching for an object." He turned from the screen to look at her, and his gaze was sharp, analytical. "The locket you wear. Tell me about it." Emma's hand instinctively went to her throat, her fingers closing around the cool, familiar silver. "It's nothing," she said. "My father gave it to me for my 16th birthday. It's just a locket. May I see it?" His tone was not a request. She hesitated, then unclasped the thin chain and handed it to him. It looked small and insignificant in his large, capable hand. He carried it over to a high-powered scanner on his desk, his movements precise. After a moment, he opened the tiny clasp. The two miniature photos smiled up at them, her mother radiant and laughing. Her father, his eyes full of warmth and intelligence. "The frame is solid silver, not hollow." Richard murmured more to himself than to her. "The hinge mechanism is standard. No microcircuitry detected." He handed it back to her, but his eyes were still troubled. "Their chatter is specific, Emma. They believe it's a key, a physical or cryptographic key to the rest of his research. Your father was a master of hiding things in plain sight." She clasped it back around her neck, the familiar weight of it now feeling strange, heavy with a significance she couldn't grasp. "It's just photos. For now we assume it's more than that," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will not take it off, and you will not leave the main house or the walled garden. Understood?" She nodded, a chill creeping over her despite the warmth of the room. The bubble of their sanctuary had grown thin. The outside world was pressing in. The breach came 2 days later. It started as a mundane annoyance, an intermittent glitch in the estate's encrypted communications network. Marcus reported it to Richard with a deep frown. "The system is self-diagnosing a fault in a fiber optic relay. It's in the junction box just outside the walled garden. The system requires a hard reset by a certified technician. There are no outside contractors allowed on this property." Richard stated, his voice absolute. "I agree, sir," Marcus said. "But the manufacturer's diagnostics are insistent. If we don't address it, the entire external network could go down within 48 hours. That would leave us blind." Emma, listening from the doorway of the study, saw the trap. A problem that only an outsider could fix. It was too convenient. Richard saw it too. His jaw was tight. He was being forced into a move. "Get me the technician's full profile. Run a deep background check. He doesn't step 1 foot on this property until I have personally vetted him. And when he is here, he will have a full security escort at all times." The technician arrived the next afternoon. His name was Paul Weller. His credentials, Richard later told her, were flawless. He was a senior engineer for the tech firm that had installed the system, a man with a decade of exemplary service and the highest security clearances. Omnicorp's infiltration was masterful. They had not sent a thug. They had sent a ghost. Emma watched from an upper window as he was escorted from the main gate by 2 of Marcus's men. He looked utterly normal, middle-aged, slightly overweight, carrying a standard toolkit. He was the very picture of harmlessness. She tried to work, but the house felt different. The knowledge of an outsider within the walls was a discordant note in the silent symphony of the estate. Restless, she sought refuge in the one place that felt truly hers, the walled garden. The air was warm, and the scent of lavender was thick and calming. She sat on the mossy stone bench, her hand clutching the locket at her throat, and tried to read. She didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone, the next he was there standing at the edge of the path. The technician, Paul Weller. He was wiping his hands on a rag, a friendly, apologetic smile on his face. "Sorry to disturb you, ma'am," he said, his voice pleasant. "Just finished with that junction box. Quite the setup you've got here. I was just heading back and saw this garden. It's beautiful." Emma's heart began to beat a little faster. Where was his escort? "Thank you," she said, her voice tight. She kept her eyes on her book, hoping he would leave. He didn't. He took a step closer. "My wife, she loves lavender. Tries to grow it, but ours always ends up looking sad." He chuckled, a disarming, folksy sound. "You have a beautiful necklace." Emma's head snapped up. His eyes were fixed on the locket. "Oh, this," she said, forcing a casual tone. "It's just an old family thing. An heirloom, it looks it. Mind if I see?" he asked, taking another step. He was closer now, too close. His friendly smile didn't quite reach his eyes. In their depths, she saw a cold reptilian focus. "I'm sorry, I'm rather busy," she said, closing her book and making to stand. "It will only take a second." He insisted, his voice losing its friendly edge. He reached a hand out, not toward the locket, but toward her arm. "I'm just an admirer of fine jewelry." Every instinct in her body screamed. This was it. This was the threat made real. She recoiled, stumbling backward off the bench, her book falling to the ground. "Don't touch me." The man's facade shattered. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold frustration. He lunged. It was over before it even began. From the deep shadows of the ivy-covered wall, two figures emerged, moving with a silent, lethal grace. A third, Marcus, stepped from behind the fountain. They converged on the technician in a blur of motion. There was no shouting, no struggle. There was a sharp grunt of surprise from the technician, the thud of a body hitting the soft earth, and then silence. It was a brutally efficient, perfectly executed interception. Marcus stood over the subdued man, a weapon in his hand that Emma hadn't even seen him draw. He looked at Emma, his gaze quick and assessing. "Are you unharmed, Mrs. Sterling?" She could only nod her body, trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sanctuary had been breached. The serpent had gotten into the garden. Two men hauled the unconscious technician away, his flawless credentials and friendly smile exposed as the lies they were. Marcus stayed with her. "You are safe," he said, his voice a calm, grounding force in her panic. "The threat is neutralized." Later, sitting in the study, a cashmere blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she couldn't stop shaking. The illusion of safety was gone, burned away by the cold focus in that man's eyes. Richard came in. He didn't rush to her side. He stood across the room, his stillness more potent than any frantic movement. His face was carved from ice, but his eyes were blazing with a cold, protective fury she had never seen before. It was the fury of a king whose fortress had been breached, whose most precious treasure had been threatened. He was an Omnicorp agent. He said, his voice dangerously quiet. One of their best, a specialist in extraction. He was not here to chat about gardening. He walked over to the desk and activated a monitor. "Your uncle provided them with a backdoor code to create the system glitch. It was his price for their continued silence." He turned to face her, his expression grim. "I have been trying to shield you, Emma, to keep you ignorant because I believed it was your armor. I was wrong. The time for hiding is over." He looked at her, his gaze intense, and the last of the walls came down. "Omnicorp is not just a rival corporation. It is a syndicate. They have government officials on their payroll. They have orchestrated coups in small countries. The men who run it are monsters who believe the world is their property. Your father was a threat to their very existence, and they extinguished him. They will stop at absolutely nothing to get his technology." He came to kneel before her, taking her trembling hands in his. His touch was firm, grounding her. "That locket," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "My sources are now certain. It is not jewelry. It is a cold key. A solid-state drive of some kind immune to electronic scanning, containing the final piece of your father's work. He gave it to you not just as a gift, but as a failsafe. He trusted you to carry his legacy around your neck, hidden in plain sight." Emma stared at him, the full, terrifying weight of the truth finally crashing down on her. She clutched the locket, its silver suddenly feeling as heavy as an anchor, as dangerous as a loaded gun. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Richard's hands tightened on hers. "Now," he said, his voice a low, hard promise. "We stop defending. We attack. I am done playing their game. I am going to burn their empire to the ground." The attack on Emma shattered the fragile peace of the estate and ignited a fire within Richard Sterling. The quiet, intellectual partner of the West Wing study vanished. In his place stood the Titan, the ruthless corporate predator the world knew and feared. The mansion transformed overnight from a sanctuary into a fortress, from a home into a high-tech command center for a war that would be fought not with bullets but with billions. Security protocols already suffocating became absolute. New teams of personnel men with the same coiled stillness as Marcus appeared. Emma no longer walked the grounds alone. A discreet armed shadow was always nearby. The silence of the house was now punctuated by the low, urgent murmur of voices from Richard's study and the constant soft chime of encrypted data streams. Emma became a spectator to a global conflict waged from a single room. She would bring Richard coffee or a plate of food he rarely touched and see the world burning on his monitors. One screen showed the Nikkei and the Dow Jones plummeting in real time, another displayed the frantic flashing headlines of financial news networks, and a third was a cascade of impenetrable code. Richard was at the center of this storm, a conductor of chaos. His voice on the phone was a weapon, cold, precise, and utterly devoid of mercy. Liquidate the entire position in Enercorp at market open. He would command a trader in London. "I want to trigger a panic sell. No, I don't care about the loss. This is not about profit. Leak the dossier on Senator Hayes to the press." He would instruct a contact in Washington, D.C. "Use the Shell Corporation in Panama. I want his career in ashes by noon." Initiate the hostile takeover of their primary logistics subsidiary. He would order his legal team in New York. "Find their debt covenants. I want to break them." Emma would watch the news, her heart in her throat, and see the real-world consequences of his commands. Omnicorp's stock price went into freefall. Senator Hayes, their key political ally in the Senate, was engulfed in a career-ending scandal. A shipping strike, seemingly out of nowhere, paralyzed their global supply chain. It was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its efficiency. Richard was not just attacking their business. He was systematically dismantling their empire brick by bloody brick. She was caught in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. A primal, selfish part of her felt a profound sense of security. The sheer, overwhelming force of his power was a shield around her. He was a dragon, and he was her dragon-breathing fire on anyone who dared to threaten her. He was doing what no one else could. He was fighting for her parents, avenging them on a scale she could barely comprehend. But another part of her, the girl who believed in the quiet goodness of her father, was deeply unsettled. Richard was ruining lives, destroying companies, ending careers. He was using the same ruthless tactics as his enemies. She wrestled with the chilling morality of it all, the terrifying truth that to fight monsters, he had to become a more intelligent, more strategic, more powerful monster himself. One night, she found the courage to confront him. He was standing in front of the glass wall of his study, staring out at the city lights, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He hadn't slept in what looked like days. The relentless pressure of the war was beginning to take its toll, visible in the faint tremor in his hand and the deep, weary lines etched around his eyes. "The news said Omnicorp is laying off 10,000 workers because of the stock collapse," she said, quietly standing in the doorway. He did not turn. "Collateral damage," he stated, his voice flat. "They're just people, Richard. People with families." He finally turned to face her, his eyes holding a cold, hard fire. "The men who run Omnicorp used one of those people to try and put his hands on you in the garden. They used their power to murder your parents and throw their car into a ravine. Do not for 1 second waste your empathy on the tools of your enemy. They made their choice when they decided to work for men like that." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. "They drew first blood when they killed David and Eleanor. I am not a vigilante seeking justice, Emma. I am an extinction-level event for every single person involved. I will not stop until their name is a footnote in a history book." His fury was so absolute, so pure, it left no room for argument. She saw in that moment the price of her protection. It was not paid in money, but in a brutal, uncompromising war that he was willing to wage on her behalf. The pressure continued to mount. A sophisticated cyber attack breached the outer firewall of the estate's network, thwarted only by Richard's own paranoid, multi-layered security protocols. A long-range drone was shot down over the northern perimeter. The threats were constant, a relentless siege that kept the entire estate on a razor's edge of high alert. The fortress was holding, but the war was taking its toll on its king. The breaking point came on a Thursday. After a grueling 72-hour marathon of financial warfare, Richard secured a final devastating victory. He had successfully triggered a clause in Omnicorp's corporate bonds, forcing an immediate repayment of billions in debt that he knew they couldn't cover. It was a mortal wound to their financial structure. Emma found him in the study long after the house had fallen silent. The monitors were off. He was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, the empty whiskey glass on the desk beside him. The Titan was gone. In his place was an exhausted, vulnerable man who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. She went to him, her heart aching with a fierce protective instinct. She said nothing. She simply came up behind his chair and placed her hands on his tense shoulders, her fingers beginning to work at the hard knots of muscle. He flinched at her touch, then slowly he relaxed into it, letting out a long, shuddering breath. He reached up and covered her hand with his grip surprisingly strong. "It's done," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Their board is in an emergency session. They're facing bankruptcy. We broke them." "You broke them," she corrected softly, her fingers never ceasing their gentle ministry. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I don't know how this ends, Emma." The confession of uncertainty from this man of absolute control was the most intimate thing he had ever shared with her. He was not a god. He was a man fighting and bleeding in the dark just like her. She moved around the chair to face him, kneeling on the floor before him. She took his face in her hands, her thumbs gently stroking his tired skin. "Then we'll face it together," she said. He looked at her, his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, now filled with a raw, unguarded vulnerability. He saw not a charge to be protected, not a partner in a legacy, but a woman strong and compassionate who was choosing to stand with him in the heart of the fire. The war, the danger, the grief, the shared purpose, the burgeoning tenderness, it all coalesced in that one silent moment. The physical space between them, which had been charged for weeks, finally collapsed. "Let me be your sanctuary tonight," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she could no longer deny. It was an offering, a choice, her final and most profound act of agency. She was not being taken, she was giving. She was choosing him. He leaned forward, and his lips met hers. And this kiss was nothing like the first. There was no hesitation, no question. This was a kiss of desperate, profound need, a claiming. It was the kiss of two survivors clinging to each other in a storm, a fierce affirmation of life in the midst of so much destruction. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her from the cold command center of their war through the silent corridors of their fortress and into the quiet sanctum of his bedroom, a room she had never before entered. There, with the lights of the distant, unaware city glittering below, their marriage contract was finally and irrevocably consumed by fire. Their union was not one of convenience or strategy anymore. It was forged in shared loss, honed in battle, and now sealed in a desperate, passionate, and profound act of love. As the war raged on outside the walls of the fortress, within its heart, its king and queen had finally found their peace. The aftermath of their union was not a gentle peace, but a quiet, focused calm before a final world-shattering storm. The war had entered a new phase. Omnicorp was financially crippled, a wounded beast bleeding in the water, but its head, a ruthless CEO named Julian Thorne, was still at large. Richard's attacks had backed him into a corner, and both he and Emma knew that a cornered predator was the most dangerous kind. Their life became a duality. By night they found solace and a fierce, desperate love in each other's arms, building a sanctuary of intimacy against the looming threat. By day, the West Wing study was their armory and their war room. The final battle would not be won with stock trades or leaked dossiers. It required a checkmate. The key, they both knew, lay in the silver locket that now rarely left Emma's sight. She spent days with it, connected to a sophisticated quantum interface Richard had designed. She tried every password, every key phrase she could remember. Nothing worked. The lock was absolute. Frustrated, she sat back one afternoon, closing her eyes and humming a tuneless little melody her mother used to sing while gardening. It was a simple, rambling tune, one with no beginning and no end. Her eyes snapped open. Her father had been a logician, but her mother had been the music in his life. The key wasn't a word. It was a song. Working with Richard, she translated the simple melody into its corresponding musical notations. C, G, G, A, G, E. It was not a password to be typed, but a frequency sequence to be entered. As she inputted the final note, the interface chimed. A single encrypted file appeared on the screen. The lock was open. What they found inside was more than they could have ever imagined. The file contained the complete, uncorrupted schematics for her father's energy core, a work of genius that would change the world. But buried within the data protected by a second layer of encryption was something far more potent. It was her father's journal. They listened huddled together in the dark as her father's voice filled the room. It was a series of audio logs recorded in the final weeks of his life. He spoke of his breakthroughs, his hopes for the future, and then his voice grew heavy with fear. He detailed the threats from Julian Thorne, the offers that became demands, the chillingly polite phone calls that were veiled ultimatums. He had recorded them. They listened to Thorne's voice, smooth and venomous, speaking from beyond the grave. A man who stands on the cusp of changing the world should be careful he doesn't fall, David. Such things can be arranged. It was the smoking gun. The undeniable proof that linked the head of Omnicorp directly to the conspiracy and the murder of her parents. Emma wept not just from grief, but from a profound, burning vindication. Richard held her his own expression, a mask of cold, controlled fury. Now he had the sword. The final gambit was born from Richard's own audacity. "We will not hide from him," he declared. "We will draw him into the light and execute him in front of the world." The plan was the inaugural Sterling Foundation Charity Gala. Its stated purpose was to fund research in clean energy. Its true purpose was to be a stage for the final act of their war. The invitations went out to the most powerful people in the world, titans of industry, political leaders, global press. Julian Thorne would be invited. He would have to come. To refuse would be an admission of defeat, a sign of weakness his teetering company could not afford. Walter and Helen would be summoned too. In the weeks leading up to the gala, Emma transformed. Richard brought in tutors not for etiquette, but for strategy, for public speaking, for how to command a room with quiet confidence. She absorbed it all. The timid girl who had trembled in a wedding dress was gone, reforged in a crucible of grief, love, and purpose. When she stood before the mirror on the night of the gala, she saw a stranger she finally recognized. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that shimmered like a midnight sky. Her hair was swept up, and around her neck against her skin lay the silver locket. She was not a victim. She was a weapon. Richard came to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, the armor of his class. Their eyes met in the mirror. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. "He won't know what hit him," she replied, her voice steady and clear. The ballroom of the Sterling Tower was a galaxy of glittering chandeliers and powerful people. Emma moved through the crowd at Richard's side, a queen surveying her court. She met the eyes of billionaires and senators without flinching. She was no longer intimidated by their power. She was part of it. The first part of the plan went into motion an hour into the evening. Richard arranged for Walter and Helen to be escorted to a private lounge, telling them he wished to discuss a final settlement. Emma entered the room alone. They looked small and pathetic, perched on a silk sofa. Helen's eyes were full of spite, Walter's full of fear. "What is this?" Helen snapped. Emma did not raise her voice. She stood before them, a figure of calm, cold authority. "This is your only chance," she said, her voice like ice. "I know everything. About the deal you made with Omnicorp. About the information you sold them. About how you delivered me to be slaughtered." Walter began to bluster, but Emma cut him off. "Richard is prepared to release evidence of your conspiracy to the federal authorities tonight. You will spend the rest of your miserable lives in prison." She paused, letting the reality of her words sink in. "However, he has authorized me to offer you a single alternative. You will confess your role. You will state that you were coerced by Julian Thorne, that you acted out of fear for your own lives. If you do this, Richard will arrange for a lesser charge. Obstruction, perhaps. You will be ruined, but you will be free." It was a lie, a beautifully crafted trap. Their only instinct was self-preservation. Walter, seeing a lifeline, began to talk a torrent of panicked, self-serving excuses. Helen, seeing her own future dissolving, joined in painting themselves as victims. They confessed everything, their words tumbling over each other in their desperation. They did not notice the small digital recorder disguised as a brooch on Emma's dress. When it was over, she simply turned and walked away, leaving them in the silent, luxurious room to await a mercy that would never come. The main event began. Richard took the stage to a wave of applause. The ballroom fell silent. Julian Thorne sat at a prominent table near the front, his face a mask of polite interest, his eyes like chips of ice. Richard began his speech, his voice resonating with power and authority. He spoke of the future of innovation, of legacy. Then his tone shifted. Legacy is not just about what we build, he said, his eyes finding Thorne in the crowd. It is about the friends we honor and the promises we keep. Tonight, this foundation is not just about the future. It is about the past. It is about a brilliant man, a dear friend who was stolen from the world. A man named David Brooks. A murmur went through the crowd. On the massive screens behind Richard, a photo of Emma's father appeared, smiling, vibrant and full of life. His work was on the verge of changing the world, Richard continued. But a man driven by greed and fear decided that future was not his to own, and so he tried to destroy it. He tried to steal it, and when he could not, he hired assassins to commit murder. Thorne did not move, but a muscle in his jaw began to twitch. For over a year, this man has hunted David's daughter, believing she held the key to his work. What he failed to understand, Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, is that David did leave a key. Not to his research, to his justice. And then he played it. Her father's voice filled the stunned silence of the ballroom, clear and strong from the audio logs on the locket. Then came the chilling, unmistakable voice of Julian Thorne making his threats. The entire room, the press, the politicians, the power brokers heard him condemn himself with his own words. It was devastating. Thorne's face went white. He was ruined. He subtly signaled to a man at the back of the room. The man, disguised as a waiter, began to move forward, his hand reaching inside his jacket. But he had only taken 2 steps before he was intercepted. Marcus and 3 other men, seamlessly integrated with the catering staff, converged on him. The takedown was silent, swift, and brutal. A collective gasp went through the room, but the panic was contained before it could start. Simultaneously, uniformed officers and federal agents who had been positioned throughout the venue moved in. They surrounded Thorne's table. He stood up, his face a mask of apoplectic rage, but there was nowhere for him to run. It was over. Another team quietly entered the private lounge and took a stunned Walter and Helen into custody. Richard finished his speech. The work of David Brooks will not be a weapon for the greedy, he declared. It will be a gift to the world, administered by this foundation in his name. He came down from the stage, the crowd parting before him. He walked directly to Emma, his eyes finding hers. He took her hand, and together they stood in the center of the silent, shocked ballroom. The flash of cameras was like lightning all around them. The war was over. He looked at her, not with the eyes of a protector, but with the eyes of a man, looking at his equal, his partner, his queen. They had won. The world was loud in the aftermath. The downfall of Julian Thorne and the implosion of Omnicorp was a media supernova, a story of corporate malfeasance, murder, and justice that dominated global headlines for weeks. But inside the walls of the estate, for the first time, there was a profound and absolute silence. The heightened security melted away, the constant hum of the war room ceased, and the oppressive weight of the siege finally lifted. The air itself felt lighter, easier to breathe. The fortress had served its purpose. Now it was simply a house. In the quiet days that followed the gala, a new unspoken tension grew between Emma and Richard. The war that had forged their alliance, that had served as the brutal, violent context for their relationship, was over. And in its absence, they were left with a question. What now? The contract that bound them, the marriage of protection, was legally and spiritually fulfilled. He came to her one morning in the walled garden. It had become their place, a sanctuary, not from the world, but for the quiet truth of their life together. She was sitting on the mossy stone bench, her locket resting against her heart, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves. He didn't approach with his usual commanding stride, but with a quiet hesitation she had never seen before. He carried a thin leather portfolio. He sat beside her, not too close, and placed the portfolio on the bench between them. "It's over, Emma," he said, his voice low. "Thorne and his associates are in federal custody. Walter and Helen have accepted a plea deal. They will be ruined, but they will not be a threat to you ever again. The danger is gone. She nodded, waiting. She knew this was more than a status update. He opened the portfolio. Inside were 2 sets of documents. Our marriage was a contract, an alliance for your protection. He continued, his gaze fixed on the papers, unable to meet her eyes. That contract has been successfully executed. My obligation to you is fulfilled. He pushed the first set of documents toward her. These are the annulment papers, signed by me. They declare the marriage void as it was entered into under duress. It will be as if it never happened. He then pushed the second set toward her. This establishes a trust in your name. It is substantial. You will be independently wealthy for the rest of your life. You can go anywhere, do anything. Attend any university, start any business, build any life you choose. He finally looked at her, and his eyes, stripped of their wartime fury, were filled with a deep, aching vulnerability. You are free, Emma. Truly free. You are no longer bound to me, to this house, or to this life. I am releasing you from the gilded cage. It was the ultimate act of love and respect. He was giving her the one thing he had originally taken away, a choice. He was risking the heart he had never intended to give, laying it bare for her to either accept or walk away from. Emma looked at the papers, at the cold legal ink that offered her an escape. She thought of the terrified girl who had first walked these halls, a girl who would have wept with gratitude for such an offer. But she was not that girl anymore. She looked at him, at this brilliant, complicated, and ferociously protective man who had gone to war for her. I was a prisoner long before I met you, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. I was a prisoner of my grief. I was a prisoner in my uncle's house. I was a prisoner of a fate that was hunting me down. She gently pushed the documents back toward him, her fingers brushing his. This house, she said, her gaze sweeping over the wild, beautiful garden, was never my prison. It was the place I learned to fight. The place I found my purpose. The place I found myself. Her eyes locked with his, and she gave him the truth that had taken root in her heart. I am not the treasure you were protecting, Richard. You are the treasure I discovered. I don't want freedom from you. I want a lifetime of freedom with you. She picked up the annulment papers, the legal document that could erase their entire history. Slowly, deliberately, she tore them in half and then in half again, letting the pieces fall like confetti onto the ground between them. This is my home, she said, her voice thick with emotion, and you are my future. A single silent tear traced a path down his cheek. He reached for her, his hands framing her face, and his kiss was not one of passion or desperation, but of profound, reverent relief. It was the kiss of a man who had been willing to lose everything and had just been given the world. 2 weeks later, they were married again. There was no empty chapel, no crowd of strangers. The ceremony took place in the heart of the walled garden under the afternoon sun. Marcus, his face for once showing a flicker of a gentle smile, stood as their witness. Emma wore a simple cream-colored dress, and Richard a linen suit. Their vows were not the formal, empty words of before, but promises they wrote themselves, promises of partnership, of shared legacy, and of a quiet, enduring love. As he slipped the platinum band back on her finger, it no longer felt like a brand, but a bond, freely and joyfully chosen. 1 year later, the Sterling Brooks Foundation was a global force for good. Guided by Emma's intimate understanding of her father's vision and Richard's strategic genius, it was deploying clean, decentralized energy to developing nations, powering hospitals and schools in places that had only known darkness. Emma was not the silent wife of a billionaire. She was the co-chair, a respected, articulate leader who traveled the world carrying her father's legacy like a torch. She stood now on a balcony of the estate, not a prisoner looking out, but a queen surveying her peaceful kingdom. The evening was warm and the scent of lavender drifted up from the garden below. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into Richard's familiar embrace. His hand came to rest protectively on the gentle, round swell of her belly. He's kicking, she whispered, covering his hand with her own. He has his mother's spirit. Richard murmured, his lips brushing against her hair. He's letting us know he's ready to take on the world. Emma smiled, a deep sense of peace settling into her soul. They had faced down the monsters and won. They had taken a legacy of pain and grief and transformed it into a future of light and hope. The gilded cage had become a home, a cradle for a new life. The marriage born of a debt had been repaid 1,000 times over, not with money, but with a love that had been forged in fire and found its peace in the quiet moments of an ordinary life. She turned in his arms, her hand resting on his heart. The terrified girl was a distant memory, a ghost she no longer recognized. The man before her was not a captor or a king, but her husband, her partner, her greatest love. They had found each other in the wreckage of their pasts and had built a future more beautiful than either could have ever imagined. Sometimes the greatest prisons are not the ones with walls, but the ones we carry inside us. And sometimes what begins as a gilded cage, a contract of survival, can become the one place where we finally learn what it means to be truly free. It is a reminder that the most profound love stories are often not the ones that start with a perfect beginning, but the ones that fight their way through the darkness to earn a beautiful dawn. Thank you for joining us for this story. If our journey together has moved you, we would be so grateful if you would show your support with a like and by subscribing to our channel. Your companionship is the greatest encouragement we could ask for, and it allows us to continue sharing stories that we hope will resonate with you. We wish you peace, and until we meet again, be well.